My name is Jonathan Neal. I am the director of the Center for Business and Management of the Arts at Claremont Graduate University, or CBMArts as we like to call it. In December, we co-published with Los Angeles County Department of Arts and Culture a report on accessibility and the arts and the role of the artist. And the purpose of that report was to begin a conversation that is not had very often, but is one that we are hoping to have and begin today. And so I'm very lucky to be joined by the co-authors of that report, Bronwyn Malden and Katrina Sullivan. Bronwyn is Director of Research and Evaluation at LA County Department of Arts and Culture. She is also, importantly, an adjunct faculty member for our programs, teaching research methods for our arts management and art business programs at CBMArts. And in addition to research in arts and culture, in her career, she has studied things such as farm worker programs, employment conditions for truck drivers, and villager organizing in Thailand. And she is also a published poet and novelist. Katrina Sullivan is a 2019 graduate of the MA in Arts Management program at CBMArts. And she has been working with Bronwyn and LA County Department of Arts and Culture for the past year as a research consultant, in which capacity she is focused on the intersection of the art making process and accessibility. And we are also very pleased, we are very pleased to have with us Carmen Papalia, who is one of the artists who contributed their intelligence to the report. As an artist, Carmen uses organizing strategies and improvisation to address his access to public space, the art institution, and visual culture. His work, which takes forms ranging from collaborative performance to public intervention, is a response to the barriers and biases of the medical model of disability. As a convener, he establishes welcoming spaces where those from historically marginalized groups realize their desires for participation through processes rooted in activism, performance, and institutional critique. And he is a 2019 and 2020 Sobey Art Award recipient. And his work has been featured at the Guggenheim, at Tate Liverpool, at Banff Center for the Arts and Creativity, and Gallery Gachet, among others. So welcome everyone, and welcome in particular, Bronwyn, Katrina, and Carmen. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks.
So as an introduction to our conversation today, I would like to play a video that our friends and partners at VidMob gives, some of whom have joined us in the audience today, I believe as well. We'd like to play you this video because this is one that we use to introduce the report to the public. And we think that it very nicely captures the conversation that we would like to have today. So bear with me while I share this video with you.
Art is a universal human experience. But what if you can't see the colors? What if you can't hear the sounds? Should we expect the artist to make art every audience can experience? It's a creative challenge and an opportunity. Let's start the conversation.
Okay, short and sweet and to the point. Thank you to Burr Purnell and the team at VidMob Gives for helping us to produce such a great piece of video. And so without further ado, let's begin the conversation. Katrina, I'm going to begin with you first. Could you tell us a little bit about the genesis of the study, about the report that you produced, where your interest in accessibility in the arts began, and how you came to focus on this question of the artist's role and responsibility?
So I have family members and people who are close to me identify as having a disability. So it was kind of familiar to me to a certain extent. And for this particular, how it all started, it was because my partner, who is deaf, we were at this museum and we were watching a video artwork without having any captions on, and he was frustrated. And so I thought it was really unfair to me that I was able to enjoy the work without any obstacles. And he would have to go to the front desk, ask for a transcript if they do have one. And so that kind of all started um, that little seed planted in my head. And so um, I knew I wanted to focus on accessibility when I entered graduate school. So with the opportunity of Brown's class, research and evaluation, I was able to dig a little bit further about how it all works. So I understood back then that museums are required to provide access because of the ADA. So I also been seeing like several artists making works that are reflecting their lived experience. So dug a little bit deeper, and I read a lot of report that talks about museums providing access. So I decided I didn't see anything about asking artists, so I decided to do that because it was uncharted territory. That's how it all started, really. Yeah.
That's super interesting. Did you have any reservations about asking that question, or did you feel pretty confident that that would be a receptive or a well-received type of question to ask?
I was worried that people might think otherwise, might think that question is ridiculous. How would you ask that question? Because in the past, it always has been artists done their work and then that's pretty much it. Um, but I think times are changing. So I had a little bit optimistic about how the outcome of the report would be. And I'm happy that it is. Yeah.
Bronwyn, what stood out to you about this research question and your interest in it from the standpoint of the county?
Well, from the standpoint of the county, our department, as a government agency that works in the arts, our role is really to ensure that everyone, all residents of the county, have access to all the benefits of the arts. And that is whether that means experiencing the arts, going to museums and galleries, or actually making art, or working in arts organizations. But since 2015, we've really been very focused on accessibility in terms of those communities that have historically had less access to the arts, historically had less investment in the arts. And so the disability community is one of those communities we've talked about. When Katrina proposed her this research plan in the class, I was intrigued. And when she said to me that she was, after the class ended, that she was interested in actually going ahead and actually doing the study that she had proposed as part of the class, I saw a tremendous opportunity for us as a department to take the time to really dig into this issue of accessibility more deeply, and for us to learn, and for us to engage with the issue. It's actually, publishing this report has actually caused some changes to our department that have been really good. For one thing, we recorded an audio version of the report, so you can look at the PDF or you can listen to the whole thing. But it also made us aware that there were some accessibility issues with our website that needed to be addressed. So we made some of those changes that had been on the docket of things we really need to do, and kind of a recognition that why have we been waiting to do it. And then the PDF itself, working with the designer to make sure that all of the best practices in terms of accessibility were built into the PDF. All of these are practices that we will continue to do beyond this report. So there's the content of the report itself, but also the way that it helped us rethink some of the things that we do.
That's fantastic. No, I echo that sentiment where it's created a level of recognition and a desire on our part too, as an institution, to think about the various ways that we need to be making our platforms and our content accessible to broader audiences. Carmen, how did you receive the questions? What was your initial thought about the report and the inquiries that were being made to you?
I think initially, I'm just happy to be asked, because I know that research in this area and data is very limited. And my own experience as a disabled artist over the years, I started practicing professionally in like 2011. And the conversation about accessibility is mainly compliance based. So it's again looking, at what the ADA requires and implementing those protocols. And for me, as an artist perspective on this topic, like I've noticed, I'm in Canada right now. I'm speaking to you from the unceded and occupied territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people. And just here, from my perspective over here, the accessibility at various institutions, like it differs from place to place, from province to province, from state to state, even though the ADA and our own, accessibility legislation here kind of like recommends a standard, still non-compliance is still widespread. And also like a lot of the accessibility law we have is not really enforceable in a meaningful way. So I really, in my own practice, try to, my big topic in my work is accessibility. So like I think about this a lot, and I try to make space for like a more broader understanding of accessibility, just not, around compliance, but more as like an ongoing effort, maybe like a relationship that could be rooted in like accountability and reciprocity. So, it's not, when I was asked like about what my sense of responsibility on behalf of the institution was with regard to accessibility, I really do feel like, this is an underdeveloped area of research, I think. And there's some things that just like, I've noticed in my own years practicing as an artist and researching this topic myself, like for example, that like people with disabilities are, if they were formally recognized, they would be the largest equity seeking group. However, they have like the least access to the cultural sector of any other group. So you think about these institutions that, purport to be public, museums, galleries are thought to be a public good, but there's a huge segment of the population that just doesn't have access and, haven't been considered, don't see themselves reflected, can't use a platform to draw visibility to their narratives and to share their narratives. And so they're not really part of like, what a museum does, which is to like, document and archive and cultural history. And I think disability culture is something that hasn't really got enough recognition because of these basic kind of like accessibility issues that, are barriers to participate for people to actually just show up. But I also think the framing around compliance to policy is quite a limiting framework too. So within my own practice, I try to talk beyond the compliance model, because I think a lot of what we're talking about here about accessibility with regard to like participating as a, maybe an attendee of a museum or a visitor, like, some of these protocols are just like the bare minimum an institution could do to have someone show up and recognize that, that space was considered with their participation in mind. Most of the times, institutions, and I would say the whole museum as a concept really emerged without the lived experience of disability in mind, and it really is in many ways about looking in a certain capacity for interpretation, and a certain skill set that I think we need to challenge if we want to make museums more open and public to the communities that institutions are hoping to serve.
All incredibly important points. I wanted to ask Katrina, the report asks sort of specifically about the perspectives of responsibility, not just of the artist or the perspectives of the artist, but also how the arts community views the responsibilities of the institution. Could you give us just a little bit of background to that to provide the context for, I think, some of the important points that Carmen was just making?
Can you repeat that question?
Yeah,
again?
so could you detail for us, for some people, I mean, I know that our audience is incredibly responsible and everyone has read the report and taken notes and followed up on all the footnotes and all the research. And so I think just as a mode to perhaps jog someone's memory a little bit to recall how the report comes down on, or some of the conclusions that you found from the way that artists and others in the arts community view the responsibility of, let's say, the institutions that have committed to showing the work and interpreting the work of artists of all stripes.
So the conclusion, well, everyone agreed that museums have that primary responsibility to exhibit any artwork, because they are responsible by legally mandated. And right now I think there's a shift to like social responsibility. They want to provide more access for their audience. And so of course, they, like Carmen have said, like ADA is really the bare minimum, and they are trying their hardest to having more accommodation, and there are technologies to help them as well. I think, yeah, it's a collected effort, and I think all departments have to work together to really creatively think like, how can we provide more for their audience, and what are the best practices. And of course, having people with disability in part of that process is very, very important, because without them you can't possibly make it work, because they have that lived experiences. So it's definitely important to have that. And so artists is also part of the society. They should, well, in that report we recommend that they be open-minded about these solutions that perhaps museums are pushing as well. Just provide more access and start little steps. Write your own visual description could be helpful as well, and adapt that and learn from how others are doing, learning from that, and start implementing access into artwork. It's all about little steps that can help better society, basically.
I think that's interesting. Carmen, it occurred to me that as an artist, your interaction with the institutions is most likely through the curatorial department, interactions with curators and perhaps educators, but so often the responsibility for ensuring accessibility doesn't necessarily fall to those areas of the museum or to an organization, and may fall to another department or another area. So could you maybe illuminate for us a little bit your sort of specific experiences engaging with the institutions, when they are dealing with your particular projects, how accessibility is brought sort of, let's say, into the full fold of how the institution operates, but then how that illuminates perhaps how the institutions don't communicate internally with one another to create accessibility across.
Yeah, for sure. And it's a bit complicated, but yeah, at the beginning of my practice, like my first few years, and as I was building my practice, yeah, many of my, I mean, and I've been lucky to have both, like my work shown in various ways by curators and brought into institutions, a bunch of projects commissioned as well. But I also, you know, in my first few years, I really was being brought in through the education department specifically because accessibility is, I think, siloed within the education department. You know, access programs as a thing grew out of you know, early docent programs, and it was, you know, this kind of scenario where a group of people without lived experience were developing practices and protocols and maybe tools that they could use to help, you know, kind of like translate the kind of more commonly shared experience of art with a disabled public. So, you know, my experience as an artist is kind of, you know, I have the work that I want to make, but then sometimes there's this expectation when I'm being invited, and you know, I've learned to advocate for myself and kind of like set boundaries about what, you know, what my labor should be dedicated to when I'm being invited to present as an artist. But like sometimes there's the expectation that because I'm a disabled artist that I'll bring the accessibility practices with me and I'll be able to do a bunch of accessibility problem solving for the institution, for like work that they are wanting to present of mine, which, you know, I'm happy to do if I have the capacity and I'm being compensated, but it's really something the institution, I think, should be doing. And when I'm also, you know, developing a piece too, you know, not all of my work is accessible to everybody, and I don't think it's possible to be accessible to everybody all the time. But I also am thinking about the ways that my work is accessible to the communities that I'm accountable to, which are, you know, the disability community and the various experiences within that. And, you know, it really is still, I think, a topic, accessibility is, that isn't shared across departments. And like in my various workshops and trainings that I do, and also my, just like my interactions with institutions around my work, it really is, it varies, like perspectives on, you know, I mean, I was working with this one pretty prominent institution in the States, and I usually start a meeting by asking, what's your relationship to the topic of accessibility? And, you know, one of the curators during that meeting was like, I know there's a bunch of stuff I need to do, and if I don't do it, I might be sued. And and another, you know, and I also asked, like, what's your sense of your responsibility to a public, you know, as curator? And, you know, another curator in that same group said, I'm a researcher. I put my research out there, and if someone likes it, they come and take a look, and, you know, I might get some feedback, but like they never had thought about their responsibility to a public. So when I hold meetings about accessibility, I usually make sure that it is a cross-department meeting. It's everyone from the director to front of house folks to docents, security guards, curatorial, and everybody's thinking about accessibility from their own position within the institution. I think that's a more holistic way, because like I think accessibility looks different from a conservation perspective to like a curatorial perspective versus like, you know, public engagement, front of house kind of considerations. So, but I think it is an ecosystem that all has to be like, you know, working and running together.
That's I appreciate that, because it occurs to me that there are very few things that can sort of incentivize or bring together the various different pieces of an institution that often are working in conjunction with one another and in alignment with one another, but are often not communicating with one another because there is such a division of labor within inside of the organization. And this this kind of condition, this kind of I think what I would hope the report spells out, this kind of creative condition, is really one that demands all aspects of the institution not just working together, which they normally do, but to be visible to one another and to sort of raise this consciousness of how they operate within the context of the differently abled and the disability communities that want to take part in what the institution has to offer.
Mhm.
Bronwyn, what does this look like then from the county standpoint? I mean, we are talking about it within the relatively the sort of range of the museum institution, the kind of organizations that interact with the artists. The county has a sort of much larger portfolio of organizations that have to be thinking about this. And so how do you see this report kind of creating a lever to move people towards this expanded notion of the types of activities that they are engaged in and the types of responsibilities that they have to their communities?
Sure. The county, we make grants to about 450 arts nonprofits of all disciplines each year. And we work with nearly every school district in the county, and we commission public art and work with, we've got, I think, 50 public art projects somewhere in the works at any one time. So we are in contact with a lot of different artists, a lot of different arts organizations. And what I think is really interesting, one of the big takeaways from this report, and it's one of the kind of themes that came out from Katrina's interviews that I think we've heard Carmen reference here, is that that thinking about accessibility means thinking about audiences differently. And I think that's really the opportunity that this opens up. I mean, from the perspective of this particular research report, we talked about in terms of artists thinking about audiences differently. But I think that's a lesson that can be applied to any arts nonprofit, to any school district that's thinking about, teaching artists coming into their schools. They're thinking about audiences differently and how we center their needs and how we're trying to serve them. And I think we're in a moment right now when, at least in Los Angeles County, most arts organizations we haven't been able to do public programming for nearly a year. Other parts of the country have been open at different rates, but here in Los Angeles, when we get to that point where we are allowed to reopen more facilities, every arts organization is going to have an opportunity to stop and think about what they've learned in the past year about who are their audiences and what are the ways they've been serving them over this past year. And is this a chance to rethink? I think about a performing arts venue. Are they going to go back and just try to go find all the folks who used to buy season tickets and make sure they come back and buy season tickets? Or are they going to think about a community that's been hard hit by this economic crisis, by the health crisis, by the social connectivity crisis, and think about what are the ways we can serve them? And so the disability community being just one part of that. And so I think that as a department, we're thinking about how do we think about the communities we serve and what is the role of arts in that in a whole different way.
Is there room to think about this as similarly a kind of division of labor, although I don't like that term, but a kind of specialization where rather than programming or even institutions being dedicated to the a more expansive open access idea of engagement. One of the things I'd been thinking about in preparation here was that we have museums that are dedicated to contemporary art. We have museums that are dedicated to certain kinds of cultural history. We have, we don't expect all institutions to focus on content that's specifically related to all times, all places, all peoples. And Carmen, you had said something very interesting about the kind of the culture that it belongs to these communities and is developed within these communities. And so I wonder if there's a place, on two levels. One, raise the level of accessibility across the board to be more welcoming for anybody out of these communities who wants to go to any type of institution or organization. I think that is fairly well accepted. But I'm curious about institutions or organizations that could really specialize in arts and culture that is coming from communities that are differently abled in this respect, but also that specialize in artwork or education or curatorial approaches that also are sort of specific to these areas. And so I'm curious about your opinions on that. On the one hand, I could see that creating silos where people then say, oh, well, that's what that museum or that institution does, so we don't have to do that. But on the other hand, it doesn't seem like any major institution is doing that kind of focus right now, and maybe there'd be a real opportunity there. Carmen, maybe you first, and then Katrina.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. I would argue that the work is already happening in grassroots communities that are organizing around, around care and support for within the disability community. So like and those grassroots orgs that are, sometimes a combination of like providing services and also offering opportunities for advancement in art making and practice are nimble. They're able to evolve and be responsive to their communities. And, they might not be the larger institutions, but I think the reason that it's not happening in the larger institutions is because those grassroots communities don't have access to those larger institutions. They haven't been invited in a meaningful way. Their participation has been already defined for them in the few ways that they're invited to participate. And, they aren't in decision-making positions and they're not represented within these institutions. And I think they will bring their practices and communities with them if they were included. And, there's the basic accessibility like of the building and to the actual activities that are contained within that building, but then there's also like the ability to decision make and contribute to like the advancement of this practice or field of study or interest that is arts and culture and all of the arts, I think. And I think people with disabilities really haven't had those opportunities to have that that meaningful participation. And I guess what I'll just say too is that like the way I define accessibility now is as a measure of agency. Do we and I think this measure of agency is really defined by the social, cultural, and political conditions in any system that we're talking about. So, and I think, one of the big things that people with disabilities have been fighting for is the ability to self-determine and to be recognized for their experiences and not having to say assimilate to some false concept of normal or normalcy. And I think there are culture and cultural protocols that they rely on for holding this safe and supportive space within community just really needs to that space, time, space, and resource have to be dedicated to that by these larger institutions. And I think the shift will happen. You have to know people who are disabled in order to care about them and like have relationships with them in order to feel like you want to bring them if you will work move forward together in community. I don't think we can, if we keep thinking around like how to accommodate people, how to like temporarily bridge participation or for a time, to augment some system that wasn't built with them in mind temporarily, in a system that isn't otherwise accessible to them. I think we you know, that's a very limited framework for engagement, and I think with what I'm hoping is more transformation within the field, and just more kind of like different ways of being and knowing to be, you know, at least considered, and for these larger institutions and platforms to make space for those.
Okay. Katrina, I want to throw a question that I think that comes off of what Carmen was just saying to you, and then to give our audience a heads up that after the next exchange, I would like to open up the conversation to questions from the audience. So please be prepared for that. Katrina, to put this out there, I think one of the conversations that the report brought up for me and is touched on is this notion of the artist as autonomous, and of the work that they make as being autonomous and somehow apart from the society that they make it in, and requiring a certain kind of freedom to do what it is that they want to do outside of these constraints. How did the responses to the report and the work that you did on the report make you think about this idea of autonomy and its relationship to accessibility, as it was detailed in the report?
I don't know how other people respond to that, because I haven't gotten any feedback, and I would love to hear more. But as to the question, I think there is this like overarching idea in Western society that individuals are autonomous and independent, when we are really interdependent, like mutually dependent. So like most of us don't grow our own food or water, etc. So I think accessibility can fit within that framework and become more normalized if we transform our mindset to be more aware of this interdependence. So that's what I think, yeah.
Raman, I want to ask you that too, since as an author of a different type of art, what is your sensibility about the autonomy versus accessibility, or autonomy and accessibility relationship?
Can you repeat the question? Sorry, my screen just froze, of course.
Since you are also an artist, could you give us your thoughts a little bit about the relationship between this idea of autonomy that the artist sits apart from, to a certain extent, the society in which they habit, in order to reflect on, comment upon, or simply to be freed of the constraints of that society in order to produce work that may have import for others? How does that work within the framework of accessibility, in your opinion? I think Katrina gave us an idea about how they could work in tandem with one another, but I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that topic too.
Well, it's interesting. My perspective as a writer and an artist is not that different from my perspective as a researcher, which is that I love the opportunity to stand a little bit, not to pretend like I'm autonomous. I love what Katrina just said, but to stand a little bit at a distance and look at the world around me and try to understand it better. Whether I understand it through the lens of collecting information from other people, listening to other people, or from the perspective of trying to imagine a world that doesn't exist, and create something that didn't exist before I dreamed it up. But I also go back and I think about something that Carmen said earlier, and that is the recognition, and thinking about this as a government bureaucrat, knowing that most arts and culture that happens out there in the world happens without us knowing that it's happening as an arts and culture agency. Most museums aren't aware of what's happening out there. That people are living rich cultural lives out in the world. And if we think about accessibility, not as how do we, define certain groups and bring them into what we're doing, but think about how do we support their cultural lives, and thinking about that both as artists and as institutions. I think that also helps us to think of ourselves as interdependent with the communities that we are part of, whether we acknowledge it or not.
I think that's a wonderful point. It reminds me of there's a fantastic book by Gregory Chollet published some time ago called The Dark Matter of the Art World, about all of the cultural and activist work that happens outside of the institutional framework. And so supporting all of that activity seems to be paramount. So at this point, I would like to open up the conversation to our audience and ask if you have questions for our panelists, for the authors of our report, or for Carmen in particular. For those of you who cannot use the chat function to put your questions in for the audience, I would request that you can turn on your videos and raise your hands, and we will take notice of who that is and move between the chat and those of you who have questions to ask in person, and we can move back and forth that way as those questions come in. Carmen, in the interim, would this be a good moment to read the open access statement, which I think would be a good transition into this next phase?
Yeah, that sounds good. And I'll just say that I wrote this manifesto in 2015 as my own kind of like position statement on the topic of accessibility. So like how I would define it. And I really think it describes most of my work, and it's enlivened in most of my work too. So this is the Open Access Manifesto.
Open access relies on those present, what their needs are, and how they can find support with each other and in their communities. It is a perpetual negotiation of trust between those who practice support as a mutual exchange. Open access is radically different than a policy that temporarily removes a barrier to participation for a group with definitive needs. It acknowledges that everyone carries a body of local knowledge and is an expert in their own right. Open access is the root system of embodied learning. It cultivates trust among those involved and enables each member to self-identify and occupy a point of orientation that centers complex embodiment. Open access disrupts the disabling conditions that limit one's agency and potential to thrive. It reimagines normalcy as a continuum of embodiments, identities, realities, and learning styles, and operates under the premise that interdependence is central to the radical restructuring of power. Open access is a temporary, collectively held space where participants can find comfort in disclosing their needs and preferences to one another. It is a responsive support network that adapts as needs and available resources change.
Thank you.
You're very welcome.
Yeah, I'd be happy to talk about that or answer any questions in the Q&A as well.
So from the audience, are there questions that you have for our panelists? And if you would like to ask them in person, please turn on your video at this point. In the interest of keeping our conversation going as those questions come in, however, I will ask one more. And this one would be to Carmen as well. Was there a particular work or a moment or series of moments that you would point to that really kind of encapsulates the way that you engage and feel and interact with the world differently than those who are not part of the disability communities or have disabilities that they are contending with?
Well, I mean, I guess when I try to make space for, what I call open access, I really think it really is about people all meeting around those ideas, and it can only go so far as the institution wants to go, or the people that I've kind of gathered want to go with it. So I'll share an example. Like I have a show coming up at the Mackenzie Art Gallery in Saskatchewan in June. And I've been working with them maybe since 2017. And you know, it started with me holding one of my open access trainings for, you know, a cross section, across departments of staff work at the institution. And, you know, this has just only gotten deeper, our conversation over the years. And, you know, I've returned multiple times a year to, like, you know, pick up this discussion. And it's led to some really amazing, just like kind of projects, and now this exhibition, which
I'm going to
one
share,
of the
sorry to interrupt, apologies. I'm going to share my screen because I have some images of that project, I think.
Yeah, so I mean, the image that you're going to show is
this is the scaffold stairwell around a center space.
So my show is called Provisional Structures, and what you're looking at is kind of like an architectural drawing of the installation that's going to be in the main space. And this is like a spiraling ramp, an accessible ramp made of scaffolding, and then there's a gathering space with an acoustical dome that kind of like dampens the sound and just focuses it in this gathering space as well in this installation. And then there also is a audio component, which is a keynote by an artist named Vo, who is an artist in Oregon, who has like a fiber arts practice, but also speaks on how to operationalize the principles of disability justice and trauma-informed care. So that's like the centerpiece of this installation. These are very much topics that I've been engaged in conversation with the Mackenzie about over the last few years. And part of my show is actually an occasion to share the Mackenzie's new accessibility mandate, which I've been working with them on. And so they called on the folks that who are in their community, who they seek advice from, like the local elders, disability justice representatives, and just folks who are longtime kind of collaborators of the institution, to draft this and to be part of this process in drafting this new accessibility mandate. And it's recently been kind of operationalized through being written into museum policy. So, you know, and it doesn't just talk about accessibility with regard to the disability community. It also talks about resisting and undoing white supremacy, and really a commitment to anti-racism as well. And with the new director of that institution, John Hampton, who's Indigenous himself, it was like really this buy-in from and support for this new accessibility mandate, and how it will be enlivened over the next few years, that required, you know, buy-in from John, as well as like everybody in every department. So yeah, that's something I'm really excited about, because I think it really is a good starting point. And the way that we developed protocols for this this new accessibility mandate is in collaboration, and it was a real creative process, where I was bringing, you know, kind of a curriculum to the institution, to the members involved, and really directing them through this conversation about what is disability justice, what is trauma-informed care.
Could you could you describe briefly too, in this image there's a red thread that runs sort of along the scaffold at ground level, that looks like it creates a kind of pathway. And then, forgive me, the audience, I'm gonna move through some of the images, but it seems like that is a reoccurring motif.
Yeah.
The use of the red thread. I've got one here of you at the top of a stairwell in an interior with the red thread kind of wrapping around a concrete wall that looks like it might be a door threshold. Could you explore that a little bit for us? Yeah.
I'll talk about that piece first. So the one that you're on, that was from a project I did in Sligo, Ireland, at the Model Contemporary Arts Center. And when I was there, I installed a few projects that just like really quickly kind of addressed my own access to the space. And that was like, I found it really hard to navigate independently. So I kind of tied these strings to fixtures and objects that already existed in the space. And these kind of indicated my most commonly used routes through the building. And I just used those strings as a tactile wayfinding tool. So I would just like, you know, feel them and feel my way through wherever I needed to go. I have used those and deployed that red string in various other exhibitions, projects, and contexts, just to improve my own access and really easy to like install and take down sort of situation. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. So I think we have a couple of questions that have come in from the audience. So one question from the audience: how do you think this discussion and research can be applied cross-culturally, i.e. taking into account different cultural understandings or definitions of disability? And I'm going to stop my share at this point. Do we have an idea about how this could work in different contexts, different cultures?
I can venture an answer, but would be happy to hear from other folks on the panel. I think that what one of the things I've heard over and over in our conversation has been the idea of not thinking about accessibility as a compliance, some kind of a legal issue, but as an issue of inclusion. And I think that, you know, the recognition of kind of our intersectional selves and the many different selves we are as each of us walks across on the planet, that if we think about accessibility as supporting people in their cultural lives, then that can broaden beyond just the disability that we're talking about, but to include many different views. But I also think cultural views, but also the way that people view themselves as their own ability, their own cultures, their own definition of how they see themselves in the world. And if we can take that approach at the center of accessibility, then it opens up a whole new world to us.
One thing I was thinking is that, you know, within a human rights conversation, you know, words like and terms like integrity, dignity, and recognition come up a lot. You know, if someone's dignity is injured, they have probably experienced a human rights violation. And I think of these as very important to the topics about to a conversation about accessibility. And just where I am right now in BC and in Vancouver here, I know that in BC, our province, you know, and even actually federally too, disability-related human rights complaints are the most reported. And you know, this is just one form of. Sorry, whenever anyone puts a question in, my robotic voice reads and it kind of throws me off for a second. Yeah, I think that they're most reported are disability related human rights the complaints, and I think that just shows that there's like ableism is still pretty pervasive in our culture, and that, you know, the cultural dimension of accessibility is really key. I think cultural competency around ableism and the unlearning of ableist premises and practices, you know, like the fact that, you know, because like, I mean, even just like to participate in the arts as a non-visual artist myself, and I haven't like identified that for you all yet, but I do describe myself as a non-visual artist. I don't use words like blind and visually impaired to describe myself because those still privilege visual experience. And so I have tried to find a way to understand my own participation or connection to this field. And given that it is a very visual field that, was really kind of emerged as I think the museum as, I mean, it's super problematic. The museum as its history is a colonial history. It still holds that history and those traditions. And I think ableism is one of those. And I think so, accessibility work has to go hand in hand with like a leadership approach on, leadership by those most impacted with the lived experience, but also, has to go hand in hand with like a cultural sort of like learning component too.
That's a great introduction also then to this question that the audience has put in. Where does language justice and multilingual offerings come into the conversation around accessibility? And then after that, Daniel, I'll call on you to ask your question on screen. Carmen, you mentioned this thing about the kinds of language that you use with regard to the sort of visual dominant or visual centric world of the arts. And I think this question just comes more to even just the accessibility with regards to just different languages themselves, whether we're talking about the kinds of access to meaning that is conveyed through language that the institution has to rely upon and how that works.
For sure. Yeah. And, within the disability community specifically too, like there's a lot of folks who rely on plain language versus like jargon language or, like specific to a field language. And, within the neurodivergent community, for example, and like, I think that is one version, but then we consider ASL. It's a good example of, like we need to be providing like a range of language and translation, first with indigenous languages, I think, as well with ASL, because like ASL is a first language for users of ASL. So if you don't provide it and just say, oh, we're providing captioning, English is not a first language for ASL users who prefer it. So like it really is telling a whole group of people that, your language isn't spoken here or available here, and you're not really considered here. So I do think, we need to broaden ideas of accessibility to include like, first preferred spoken language. And yeah, whether that's for, various foreign languages or just looking at like, local traditional languages of indigenous communities, and also those, within our own disability community. And one of my choices for my show at the Mackenzie is to have all the interpretive text in plain language as like our primary offering. And then there's like, translation, like more, beyond that as well. But we do have a range of languages, indigenous and otherwise, that will be available for my show.
Thank you. Daniel Navama, you had a question you wanted to ask on screen.
Yes, thank you very much. I didn't want to interrupt the interesting dialogue being taken place. So first off, thank you very much for all those on the panel for your contributions. They're very insightful, as well as Carmen, with very articulate with the issues and that need to be bridged. I did, however, want to raise a concern, and I don't know if other people here are thinking about it also, and maybe is the reason why it's hard to participate with a question. So I'm just going to speak on my behalf. This dialogue, as fascinating as it is and as relevant as it is, it's difficult to bridge when we ourselves individually do not have the problems that are being discussed. It's hard to find something to resonate with. So I can understand that artistically speaking, if it's articulated in a way that conveys that experience individualistically, then it becomes almost empirical knowledge. So for example, what I was thinking about is, I was a docent at the Getty before COVID. And I was thinking in my head how the Getty has made a lot of accessible aspects in their architecture. When you arrive in the parking lot, or if you arrive in the front, wherever it is that you may arrive by bus or by car, how they make it accessible. But then I was realizing, you know, if you don't have legs, for example, and you can't walk up their series of stairs or go down their series of stairs, you have to go all the way in the corner where there is an elevator that takes you, and then you have to kind of find your way back to the front. So I was just kind of thinking from a participatory kind of approach, how there is this sort of marginalized relationship to access from at least just the focal point of where everyone else is coming into. So I guess my concern from an artistic view is, how would we invoke the unthinkable? Is there an art performance project or something that can be had? And I'm asking, I guess, both the panelists that are both researchers as well as the artist, what thoughts they may have in terms of, instead of just trying to convey the policy and trying to convey the contents, which honestly, as insightful and as pertinent as it may be, it can get heavy in language. You just hear the word accessibility and disability over and over again, and you don't really understand what it means to be disabled in some capacity, to having access to art. I personally do not. I have my own issues, but I do not have physical disabilities. I can see, I can hear, I can taste, I can participate in the sense that I have 5 fingers and 5 toes, you know, I'm sorry, 10 fingers and 10 toes, and my ability to access a physical museum or gallery. I cannot relate to those who do not have those things. I'm wondering, is there a performative piece that can articulate that experience to me? What it means to not walk up the stairs, having to be forced to go the route that those that have alternative or rather lacking abilities in some capacity have to go a different route of accessibility, something to give me an experience to understand why it's difficult, what is lacking, what needs to be participating in the contribution, or rather what needs to be part of the conversation. I can't participate in that conversation if I myself don't know what it means to experience, or rather, lack of better phrasing, walk in the way of a struggle.
So I think it's a great point to bring up, and thank you for doing it. I'm sure Carmen, you've got some ideas, and Bronwyn and Katrina, you do too. I would note that I believe that there was some suggestions in the report about, you know, things like touch tours, and there's some other you know, for people who could be able to go into an exhibition and be able to sort of feel artifacts and feel artworks and use other senses to engage with, and other ways of being in spaces to engage with exhibitions. And so I think those are a start. But I also take what Daniel just said as a kind of inducement to say, what would it be like to imagine an exhibition or an institution that was built from the get-go with this idea of accessibility in its bones, so that there aren't sort of alternative paths or workarounds or things that any one group is determined to go into to occupy, which creates a kind of differentiation before anybody observes it. So I'm eager to hear from Carmen and from Bronwyn and Katrina on this too.
Yeah, I would say, how do you relate? Well, you have to start making relationships with the folks that you're talking about. I think it really is about getting to know someone through like some reciprocal relationship that isn't service-based or isn't a one-way exchange, which, you know, is usually how disabled people are interfacing with institutions, is receiving something that they require, but not having to contribute anything to the relationship. So I think it is about making, you know, strong relationships with people who are disabled, who hold lived experience, because they are experts on their own experience, and they also know what systems failing feel like, and they know about the failures, a lot about the failures they've experienced. So they're the best, knowledge when it comes to orienting you to the issues of their experiences, if they want to. But they definitely, if their information is benefiting an institution, they should be compensated for that. I have a performance that I've been doing since 2010, where I take groups of up to 90 people on eyes closed walks. They all line up behind me, link arms and shut their eyes. I take them on at least an hour-long walk through the city. I tell people that the experience is not meant as a walk in my shoes. It's not a translation of my experience, because there's so much of that that I can't easily share with people. I can't share the feeling of being alienated in a visual culture as someone who is non-visual. But I can invite people to shut their eyes and link arms with each other and practice using their in order to practice using their non-visual senses. I think really that shift in one's perception of the world around them really kind of helps ground them in a way, and helps you recognize maybe some of the dimensions of sensory dimensions that we don't usually spend too much time thinking about. And yeah, I think it is kind of like a challenging of what you know to be true, and really allowing people who do hold that lived experience take up that space, learn from them, and take their leadership.
And I wanted to add there, Carmen, I think that's incredibly well said, but also there's a sense in the work that you've been doing that arrayed underneath these terms like social practice or what have you. But looking at some of the work that you produce, there is a formal sensibility in the kind of traditional artistic sense of form versus content, where to make work that is informed by and about these conditions of being in the world requires a very in-depth dealing with questions of form, and how the art not just appears in the content that it holds, but its experience and the type of let's say the type of language that the art itself is speaking, which I find to be very generative and important for a type of work that especially at a moment where a lot of the work that people are either desiring or are interested in seems to go so quickly to content. It's got a message that it's trying to convey, whereas a lot of the work that in your practice is about a kind of experience or a kind of condition that it's trying to unfold for others. And I find that to be very sophisticated and certainly at need at the moment.
Well, I'll just say, like, when I started practicing as an artist, and part of what I hope to do even now with my platform is to I want to reach an uninformed, non-disabled art audience. I think that's usually where the trouble starts for me, is those encounters where someone's assuming my needs, or like someone's where I can't advocate for myself so easily, and it requires this long process of it's not always possible to hold a meaningful conversation about accessibility or what I need. But I think in these art experiences, my social practice, I'm able to define that conversation. And so, yeah, I still, part of my work I do is to, in effort to reach an uninformed, non-disabled art audience. And I know what the conventions of that audience are. So I think sometimes I play with that.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're coming up on the end of our conversation here, but I wanted to ask Katrina one last question. Where do you think this report and this research will take you next?
Well, I think right now, as of now, I just want to have more conversation, and hopefully, like LA County have done, just improving within their own organization. And hopefully this report will start that and continually start that amongst artists and local organizations or museums across the state, hopefully. And I don't know if I will do another research report about this because it's such a complex topic. And at the beginning, I did have moments of struggle thinking went over my head thinking I can conquer this. But thank goodness with a lot of words of encouragement, I was able to do it. So I think as of now, I just want to see how this report takes itself. Yeah.
Good. Well, Bronwyn, Carmen, Katrina, Vicky, and Cameo, thank you so much for being participants in this conversation. Katrina and Bronwyn, thank you for all of the work that you've done on this report and putting it out to the public. Thank you to LA County for being great partners in that. And Carmen, thank you very much for your time and intelligence today. It's super interesting and very helpful. And to Vicky Bond and to Cameo Hunsaker, thank you so much for your services to our conversation. And to our audience, thank you for joining us. One note of apology, I learned that the video that we showed at the top may have not had sound for some of you who were hoping for it. I promise it does have sound. In the recording of this conversation, we will ensure that that is fixed, and so that you will have access to that and you'll be able to see the good work of that 30-second video. But until then, thank you all again. We really appreciate your time, and look for us to be back here soon with some more interesting work coming from CBMArts and from LA County. Bye, everyone. Thank you.